Thank you so very much, and welcome everyone. There is a description of Arrive, and I want to thank them for hosting this webinar today. Fasten your seatbelts. We've got a lot to talk about. Certainly a volatile time in the markets, so the financial markets. So much of what's happening out there in the freight flows becomes even more interesting, even more important. For most of you may know me. If you don't, that's me. And let me tell you a bit about our firm. What we pride ourselves on is having one of the largest, if not the largest, database of transportation goods flow, what I would call a data lake, every mode you can imagine, especially in North America, but many of those data feeds extend to internationally. We use that to provide insights into investing in the transportation industry for people who manage money, for pension funds, hedge funds, mutual funds, professional money managers, but also use that data to provide insights to those who manage companies in the transportation universe. Anyway, that's what we do. Anyway, let's talk about freight. I like to tell people that are involved in the transportation economy all the time that you know more about what's going on in the economy than Wall Street does. If you just stop quietly, take a deep breath, and trust what you know more than plenty of people with PhDs in economics. That said, this isn't your father's economy. Things are different than they were, and they've been changed dramatically by technology. There's an ongoing right now cadence of stories about how we're late in the cycle. We've had an economic expansion since 2009, and that this is a long economy, that we're late in the cycle. I disagree. I say we're early in the cycle, and let me explain why. 2009 through 2014 was the first industrial-led recovery the United States has gone through since 1961. That said, when the price of oil fell in late 14 and into 15, we saw fracking activity cease, and we had a mini industrial recession in the United States. Late in 16, as oil came back above first 40, then 45, and into 50, it recovered, and away we've gone. We had no consumer cycle in the 09 through 16 timeframe. Consumers just didn't grow income, and they just didn't grow spending. So there really wasn't a consumer recovery. That has changed. We have seen in 17 and throughout 18 an improvement in consumer income and an improvement in consumer spending. And there's been a couple of reasons for it. I already said this about oil. I will point out the third economy. There are three economies in the U.S. One's the industrial economy, one's the consumer economy, one's the technology economy. And if you don't think the technology economy is thriving, then you're not paying attention. Go try and find a hotel room in San Francisco or Seattle for less than $400 a night that doesn't have bed bugs. It's amazing what's happening in the U.S. technology economy. And I would point out that in the technology economy globally, the U.S. continues to be the world leader in the development and creation of new technology, both hardware and software, on all levels globally. Consumers started to spend in 17. There's a number of reasons for that. We're seeing the housing is poised to continue to the upside. What really happened is millennials are moving out of the basement, and those who predicted that would never happen were just not paying attention to demographics. The bottom line is that my parents got married later than my grandparents, and I got married later than my parents, and my children are getting married later than I am in general. What's happened? Why is that happening? Well, as life expectancies get longer and education rates get higher, it tends to delay getting married. Net result is millennials are getting married later than their parents did. And there's nothing that drives housing like household formation, like getting married. So consumers started to spend in 17 as we finally got the demographics. Millennials started to form households in earnest. And also their grandparents, the baby boomers, saw their investment accounts reflate, which made them decide they were going to spend a little bit more money and or even help their grandchildren with that down payment on that first house. You see big box retailers in general continue to disappoint, but e-commerce is just in fuego. It literally is growing as fast as the physical infrastructure will allow it to, and quite frankly, as fast as demographics will allow it to. You know, most of the baby boomers will never buy much of anything on via e-commerce because the oldest of them don't even know how to turn a computer on, and millennials, well, they'll buy almost everything via e-commerce. I would point out the trucking data has historically been the most predictive of all the modes, and it's never been more sophisticated. We now know more about what's going on than we ever have. So let's look at some of the freight flows real quick and get to the meat of this. Enough of me philosophizing. Consistently, the best predictor of what's going to happen in the industrial economy has been chemical carload volume via rail, and it's simple. It's almost impossible to make or assemble anything of any mass without consuming some form of chemical, and it's up and to the right. It's been a great predictor of the ISM manufacturing index and is signaling positive activity. Why? Because it means purchasing managers are signing POs. The critic out there could say, well, that's a false positive because you're including petroleum carloads, and that's because of fracking. And indeed, that has been a positive contributor to the chemical carload volume in the United States. I would also point out that it's also a positive contributor to the industrial economy. However, that said, okay, let's take what they're saying into account and let's subtract that. If you take chemical carload volume X petroleum carloads, X crude by rail, you get this picture. And without crude by rail, chemical volume is still running at levels that are essentially 10% plus higher than they were a year ago. Sign of a continuing growth, continuing expansion in the U.S. industrial economy. You want to know what's going to, how many houses we're going to build? Look at lumber shipments. It's very simple. I was seeing a client in Great Britain back in the 06 timeframe, and I was pointing out the decline in lumber meant that the housing market in the United States was the process of going significantly lower. And I'll never forget, he leaned back in his chair and he said, "Oh, that's right, you all still make houses out of wood." And I was like, "Well, what the hell do you make houses out of?" And he said, "Oh, mostly stone and masonry. We deforested here hundreds of years ago." And I said, "Well, not U.S. We still make houses out of wood. Therefore, if I want to know what's going to happen with housing starts, I look at lumber, because you have to get the lumber harvested. The tree has to be harvested, has to be cut into boards, has to be dried, and then shipped to the job site before you can begin the construction." Consistently, we're seeing that those materials shipped via rail, excuse me, up 6% versus where they were a year ago. That means continued strength in housing. I know the last data point was a disappointment to some, but the bottom line is the ongoing trend is going to be up. Excuse me. Best measurement out there right now, available on what's happening in truckload, is the DAT monthly barometers. Actually, they come out every week. This is the dry van. And what this does is very simple. As many of you probably are aware, DAT has the largest database of loads posted and loads searched for, and trucks posted and trucks searched for of anyone else in North America. Consistently the largest database by a large margin. We went in and looked at their data and built a barometer. This looks at the balance between those measurements and determines how over demand or overcapacitized we are. I look at its ability. Historically, it's done a phenomenal job of predicting the spot market, and that you can see that in this data when you line up the dry van monthly barometer with the nominal spot market price. It becomes even more clear, even to the non-mathematician, if you look at the year-over-year change in the spot price. And this is the monthly. I will tell you, you just have to trust me, that the same pattern you've just seen in dry van and spot price exists also for reefer and reefer spot price and flatbed spot price. but I'm not going to bore you with those slides. Those are available through either me or DAT, and the bottom line is there's a very tight relationship. It tells you what's going to happen with spot price. As everyone else in the marketplace also probably is well aware, the magnitude and duration of changes in spot price determine what's going to happen with contract price. Said another way, if spot price goes up a lot, it stays up for a long time, contract price will go up. If it goes down by a lot and stays down for a long time, contract price will come down. But the bottom line is that the DAT barometers tell us what's going to happen to spot price, and spot price tells us what's going to happen with contract price. We're finally getting contract spot prices to come back to where they ought to be. There ought to be a gap. It ought to be cheaper to get services on a spot basis than it is a contract basis. And we had a period earlier this year in which in all three modes, dry van, reefer, and flatbed, we saw the spot price actually get above contract, which is rare for it to happen in any mode, but even rarer for it to happen in all three modes at the same time. Host of factors as to why, we can talk about that later, but the bottom line is we're getting back to a more normalized market as contract rates have gone up and spot prices have become less. They're still up, but they're just less in fuego than they were just a couple of months ago. Here's the dry van weekly barometer. And what we're seeing more than anything right now is that first we saw people learn how to use the ELDs. We're still more loads than trucks, but it's a less frenetic search for trucks than it was, and almost panic levels we saw earlier in the year. Loads posted, loads are being accepted when tendered, fewer loads rejected. We can talk about that later. Our favorite predictor of holiday shopping is the container volume coming in, and we're seeing good volume coming into Long Beach, LA, which is the largest import container port in the United States. It's a little over a third of the total volume. It's more than almost two thirds of the West Coast volume alone, and we're seeing up year-over-year levels. You can see that is represented in the head haul index. I'm a huge fan of what FreightWaves is doing with their sonar product. And you can see how it affected the head haul index. That container volume positively affected the head haul index coming out of the Southern California market first. And then as trucks are moving those containers out of that market towards other places, to distribution centers. And then you saw it also begin to more recently affect rail markets. So, the BN is taking a container from Long Beach, LA to Chicago, and as those containers start to land there, it drives up the head haul index coming out of Joliet, Illinois. So you're seeing what I call rail destination markets, or intermodal rail destination markets, such as Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas. You're all seeing this kind of spike up as you're seeing depicted here in this head haul index. Again, another FreightWaves sonar data chart. Clearly, real time shows you what's going on in the marketplace. DAT barometer, again, another DAT barometer. This is exactly what's going on in reefer. Again, we're seeing more loads than trucks, not the frenetic levels we saw earlier in the year, but still indications that we're going to see some continued strength in spot pricing and contract pricing. Loads still exceed capacity. Same has been true with flatbed, but we've had a little bit different happen here. I would point out that flatbed has had more difficult time figuring out how to use ELDs than the other modes, in part because they have a smaller trailer to tractor ratio, in part because 1 to 1, 1.1 to 1 instead of 2.5 to 1 like you'd find a dry van, in part because the driver, for I think obvious reasons, wants to be involved in the loading. If it's not secured properly and he hits the brakes, the load shifts forward and kills him. And beyond the liability of the other motoring public, the driver wants to be involved in loading the truck, and so that eats into his driving time and into his 14-hour window in which he can accomplish his driving. Net results is that flatbeds have had more difficulty adapting to the use of ELDs than any other mode, but even flatbed is beginning to figure it out. 1. Two, the U.S. industrial economy is still strong, it's still in a growth mode, but not anywhere near what it was in May. It had gotten to in May and June. And what I've been telling folks is it's a lot like, that first cool day in the fall or that first warm day in the spring. We're used to the weather being 95, 100, 105 degrees. 60 degrees seems cold. We're used to the weather being single digits, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15 degrees outside, bitter cold. 60 degrees seems balmy and warm. I would tell you that right now, the demand environment is still balmy and warm. It's still 60, 70 degrees. It's just that we were used to extraordinarily high, 100 plus degree weather with an enormous amount of humidity in the economy. And that result is that as demand comes down to more regular levels of growth and the flatbed community begins to learn how to use their equipment, we've seen a more rational balance. Still more loads than trucks, but not to the just extraordinarily extreme level that we saw in May and June. All right, so what else changes things? Ideas change the world. That sounds almost trite to say, but it is indeed the fact. I love to point this out to people who manage money because they don't seem to have ever figured this out. This almost seems intuitive to most people who route freight, but it's important to point out the obvious to all of you, and that is that the density is the destiny. What do I mean by that? If you look at the world in a value to density spectrum, so I've got the lowest value, the highest density goods out there. I've got creek gravel, trash on one end of this spectrum. On the other end of that spectrum, I've got high value, low density. I've got the latest, greatest computer chip, the human heart that needs to be transplanted. All the goods in the transportation spectrum fall somewhere in that. Once I start looking at the world that way, you notice several things. One, that most goods are becoming higher value, lower density in their very nature. The IBM Selectric typewriter becomes the laptop, computer becomes the iPad. Two, new goods, all the new goods we're creating are high value, low density. We're not creating new kinds of creek gravel. We're creating smartphones. And third, what I call the durability disposability paradox. And that is, if I ship you the cement and steel to build a building or a road or a bridge, I'm not going to need to ship it to you again for decades, maybe not ever in my lifetime. But if I air freight you, and that's how I ship you a new smartphone, what am I going to do within 3 years? I'm going to air freight you another cell phone. So the higher the value, the lower the density it is, the more disposable it tends to be. The lower the value, the higher the density, the more durable it tends to be. And that result is you can look at studies by Boeing and others about how worldwide air freight tonnage has grown at a pace roughly 2x worldwide GDP, roughly 2x world trade, and they'll say things like, well, of course, this isn't sustainable. And I sit there and think, well, maybe it actually is. Why is this usable? This is usable. You think, well, this is intuitive. Thank you for pointing out the obvious, Donald. But why this is usable is that it's driving activity that otherwise wouldn't be predicted. One is this. We did a study using some Amazon distribution centers. And if I go to, say, a Walmart distribution center, and I look at the trailers going into it and the trailers coming out of it, it's roughly 1-to-1. They may come in full of one product and go out full of a host of products headed to a store, but it's a roughly 1-to-1 ratio. When you go to look at an e-fulfillment warehouse, what happens is you see roughly 8 to 18 times as many trailers coming out of it as you do coming into it. Why is that? Well, because they're packed very nicely, neatly, very densely going in, but going out, they're surrounded by pillows of air. It's one little product in a big cardboard box. And that result is all of those trailers going out are cubing out long before they would ever weigh out. And they take up literally 8 to 18 times as many trailers. Now, I understand they're not going very far. They're not going more than 100, 150 miles at most, probably, out of those centers. However, that said, that's a change in the patterns. that most people haven't stopped and thought about and acknowledged. The last thing I tell you about all of that data is this. If you want to know which of your customers are going to A, grow the fastest over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and B, be willing to pay you for service, the answer is the higher the value, the lower the density of the products they're having you ship for them, the more they're going to be willing to pay for service, because your cost of transportation is a small percentage of the cost of goods delivered, and the more likely it is what their shipping volumes will grow over time. So here's my predictions about the futures, then we'll do a Q&A. The driver market is going to stay incredibly tough until it doesn't. And that it doesn't is when we get to more automation, autonomous trucks, which I think will happen faster than most. There's so many saying, oh, well, it won't happen in my lifetime. Well, I can't imagine it'll ever happen. Well, let me tell you this. 20 years ago, 20 years is a long time. 20 years ago, my BlackBerry read an email one line at a time as I scrolled up and down versus the smartphone we all have today. TL pricing power, 8 to 12% this year. Then I'm looking for maybe 3 to 4 next at most. And I've been seriously consider lowering that estimate recently, based upon more recent data. The pricing power that's been achieved by the industry has not been used to enhance margin. It's been used to hire and retain drivers and lower the average age of fleet, which has been successful at lowering significantly, if not growing fleets, certainly lowering significantly unseated truck count. And the net result is we do have the addition of some additional capacity. I said this for several years going into the rule change, and I continue to hold fast. Electronic onboard recorders, ELDs, whatever you want to call them, have a big impact on capacity initially, but they've had an even bigger impact on equipment visibility, bigger impact on loading and unloading behavior. Everyone said it would reduce permanently capacity. I continue to vehemently disagree with that, because it would be one of the first times in history that you'd applied additional technology to an industry and it became less efficient. That just doesn't make sense. And as a good friend of mine at A.G. Edwards used to always say, calamities well anticipated seldom are, and everybody knew the rule change was coming, so everyone had a chance to plan for it and adapt. Autonomous trucks are further away. They're going to happen in our lifetime, but it's because insurance companies will make less money, and because who is responsible for the accident when it happens is going to shift, and as a result, you'll have parties that will fight it. Not only will the railroads fight it, but the insurance companies will fight it, and so will the OEMs. Consolidation in transportation will continue because it makes sense. There is so many reasons from a operating perspective, from a capital perspective, from a technology perspective. There's leverage, and so we're going to see that continue. We're in the next stage of economic growth. We're going to have ebbs and flows, but as I pointed out, we're still early in this cycle. I still see us as being in the first 18 months to 2 years of both the consumer cycle and the industrial cycle, even though the industrials have cooled a little bit recently. Inflation's DOA for the foreseeable future, as I've pointed out for probably more time in slides than I should have. Value brand names continues to decline. Think about brand names that have been created in the last 10 years that we didn't even know existed. They're now dominant brands. Last 20 years, things that didn't even exist. Biggest current threat to the economy and the economic security continues to be trade war. And we'll see how it meters out, but the economic history is very, very clear. The 1929 recession became the Great Depression because of trade tariffs and trade wars. The Smoot-Hawley trade tariffs is what created the Great Depression. So if we're negotiating with the Chinese and that's all this ends up being is bluster, that's one thing. If we end up in a prolonged, drawn-out trade war between the world's two largest economies, that's another matter entirely.